The Mount Vernon Correctional Facility was located on the outskirts of the town of the same name, like a growth on a healthy body. Gray concrete walls topped with barbed wire rose above fields of corn and soybeans. It housed about 800 medium-security inmates, thieves, con artists, drug dealers, people whose crimes did not shock the public but required isolation from society. Officer Mark Davis stood at the main entrance, watching as the prison bus pulled up to the checkpoint. 15 years of service in the correctional system had taught him to read people at a glance. Newcomers always stood out, their eyes still burning with fear mixed with despair. Experienced inmates moved differently, with the familiar caution of predators who knew the rules of the jungle. Davis was a man of the old school. He grew up in a mining family, served in the army, then came to work in the prison when the last mine in the county closed. He didn't like change and was suspicious of what he called modern trends. But his professionalism required him to maintain order regardless of his personal preferences. 6 men in orange jumpsuits bound in chains got off the bus. Davis scanned the list of new arrivals. Casey Thompson, fraud, 2 years. He looked up and saw a tall figure with long, dark hair tied back in a ponytail. Even in a prison uniform, it was clear that this person took care of themselves. Neat movements, straight posture. But something about this figure made Davis frown. "Documents for Thompson?" he asked the escorting officer. "Transgender female," the officer explained quietly. The administration decided to place her in the men's block, as required by state law. Davis nodded slowly. He had seen all kinds of things in his years of service, but cases like this were rare in their institution. He understood that this meant additional security problems. At that moment, Brian Morgan was arranging books on the shelves of the prison library. 28 years old, of average height, with delicate features and attentive eyes. He had been here for 8 months for burglary, a desperate attempt to pay for his sick mother's medical bills. Brian didn't hide his sexuality, which made him a target for some of the other inmates. But his work in the library and his calm demeanor helped him avoid serious conflicts. The library was his refuge. Here, among the books and silence, he could forget where he was. He read everything he could get his hands on, from classics to contemporary novels, from law textbooks to psychology books. Knowledge helped him survive. "Morgan," the guard's voice rang out. "We have a newcomer. Show him around the library and explain the rules." Brian looked up and saw a tall figure in the doorway. His first impression was mixed. There was something feminine about the person's features and movements, but the fact that they were in the men's wing suggested otherwise. He understood immediately. "Casey?" he asked quietly. "Yes," replied a voice higher than Brian had expected. "Casey Thompson." "Brian Morgan, welcome to our library." Casey entered cautiously, looking around. She was 32 years old and had already spent several months in a detention center, but the prison atmosphere still frightened her. She had a degree in computer science and had worked as a programmer until she ran into financial difficulties after transitioning. Fraud was an attempt to survive in a world that didn't always accept people like her. "It's quiet here," she said, looking at the bookshelves. "The quietest place in this place," Brian agreed. "You can read, study, work on your appeal. Just don't break the rules." Their conversation was interrupted by a loud voice from the hallway. "Hey, look who's here!" A massive man with tattoos on his arms appeared in the doorway. Tommy Brooks, Brian's cellmate, was 35 years old and serving time for assault. He was one of those people who considered prison an extension of the streets, where the laws of force and prejudice ruled. "Morgan, what's this circus?" Tommy looked at Casey with undisguised hostility. "This is the library, Brooks. This is where we read books," Brian replied calmly, but there was tension in his voice. "I'm not here about the library." Tommy took a step forward. "I'm talking about your new friend." Casey pressed her lips together, but didn't back down. Over the years, she had learned to take a punch, but prison was a special place where weakness could cost you your life. "We don't have a problem," Brian said firmly, "and we won't." "We'll see." Tommy smirked and walked away, but his gaze promised more to come. Later, in the office of Dr. Sarah Wilson, the prison psychologist, plans were being discussed for the new inmates' adjustment. Sarah had been working in the system for 10 years, and her experience told her that every newcomer required a special approach. "Casey Thompson," she said, looking through the file. "College education, worked in IT, financial problems led to fraud. A transgender woman in the men's block is always difficult." She understood that the administration was following the letter of the law, but her heart told her that this decision would create additional problems. In her practice, she had seen cases where such decisions led to tragedy. "We'll need to have a few sessions," she wrote in her notebook. "Assess the risks, help her adjust." That evening, in his cell, Brian lay on the bottom bunk, thinking about his meeting with Casey. Something about her attracted him. Not just her looks, but the way she carried herself, the way she spoke. He knew that feelings like that could be dangerous in prison. "Don't even think about it," Tommy grumbled from the top bunk. "This isn't a place for love games." "I'm not thinking about anything," Brian replied, but he knew he was lying to himself. Meanwhile, Casey, in her solitary cell, a privilege granted by the administration for security reasons, was trying to get used to her new reality. The sounds of the prison, the smells, the feeling of constant danger, it was all part of the new world she would have to live in for 2 years. She thought about how difficult it would be to stay true to herself and not lose her dignity. Meeting Brian gave her hope that not everyone in this place was hostile, but she knew that many trials lay ahead. Officer Davis was making his rounds before the guard change. 15 years of service had taught him to sense the atmosphere in the facility. Something had changed today. Casey's arrival was already affecting the dynamics between the inmates. He saw the glances, heard the whispers, felt the growing tension. "We'll have to keep a close eye on things," he thought as he wrote his duty report. The first day showed that life at Mount Vernon Prison had become more complicated. New tensions, new alliances, and new conflicts had emerged. Brian felt drawn to Casey, which in prison was like walking through a minefield. Casey realized that she would have to fight not only for her physical safety, but also for her right to remain human. Tommy saw a new target for his aggression. Davis realized that order in the institution was under threat, and Dr. Wilson prepared herself for what promised to be a very difficult case. Night fell on the correctional facility, but sleep did not bring peace. Each of the main characters in this story lay in the dark, thinking about a future that seemed increasingly uncertain and dangerous. A week had passed since Casey's arrival. The prison routine was slowly consuming the newcomers, turning them into cogs in a large machine. Each day began with a 6 a.m. wake-up call, followed by breakfast in the dining hall, where hundreds of men devoured tasteless food under the watchful eyes of guards. Casey quickly learned the rules of survival. Keep quiet, don't attract attention, find your niche. The library became her refuge, as it had once been for Brian. Every day after lunch, she would come here, sit in the far corner, and read. At first, she read legal reference books, studying the possibilities of appeal. Then she switched to fiction, trying to distract herself from the reality around her. Brian watched her surreptitiously. Casey read with complete immersion, sometimes making notes in the margins of old magazines. Her fingers were long and slender, despite the lack of manicure. She often adjusted her hair, and this gesture seemed touchingly feminine to him in the rough male environment. "What are you reading?" he asked once, approaching her with a book in his hands. "Margaret Atwood, The Handmaid's Tale," Casey replied without looking up. "It helps me understand how people adapt to a system of oppression." Brian sat down on a nearby chair. "Powerful book. I read it a few months ago. Atwood understands how power distorts people." Casey finally looked up. Do you read a lot? There's not much else to do here, he smiled. I used to only read technical magazines. I worked as a system administrator at a small company. Are you a programmer, if I'm not mistaken? I was, Casey said sadly. Web development, mobile apps. It was going well until my life went off the rails. They spoke quietly, cautiously. In prison, any intimacy could be misinterpreted, and for people like them, that was especially dangerous. But something drew them to each other. Shared interests, similar fates, or simply the human need for understanding. How are you holding up in here? Brian asked. Trying to keep a low profile, Casey said, closing her book. It doesn't always work. She was right. Over the past week, a field of tension had formed around her. Some inmates looked at her with curiosity, others with hostility. Tommy Brooks was one of the latter. His group, 3 men united by shared prejudices and a thirst for power in the small world of cells and corridors, made no secret of their hostility. It's not right, Tommy told his supporters in the cafeteria. A men's prison should be for men. These perverts are ruining the whole system. Sitting next to him were Danny Krause and Rick Spencer, petty criminals who had found a way to feel important in prison by joining a stronger leader. They nodded in agreement with everything Tommy said. Maybe we should show them that this isn't a place for games, Danny suggested. Hold on, Tommy stopped him. Let's see how it goes. But if they start messing around, we'll put them in their place quickly. Their conversation did not escape the attention of Officer Davis. He was having lunch at the next table and heard every word. 15 years on the job had taught him to recognize danger before it took shape. Groups in prison formed for various reasons: race, region, criminal activity. But at the core was always the simple human need for belonging and protection. After lunch, Davis went to Dr. Wilson's office. Sarah was working on reports, but she put her papers aside when she saw his serious face. Problems? She asked. Not yet, but there could be, Davis said, sitting down in the chair opposite her. Thompson. A conflict is brewing around her. I've had a few sessions with her, Sarah said, pulling out a folder with her notes. Smart, educated, but very vulnerable. The transition was painful. Her family turned their backs on her. She lost her job. The fraud was an act of desperation, not greed. I see, Davis nodded. But it's not about her. It's about how others react to her. Brooks is gathering a pack. What about Morgan? I saw them talking. Morgan is a good guy. Quiet, doesn't cause any trouble. But if he gets between Brooks and Thompson... Sarah understood. In prison, alliances and feuds developed according to their own rules. The administration could control overt displays of aggression, but it couldn't change human nature. Maybe we should transfer Thompson to another block, she suggested. I tried talking to the boss. There are no vacancies in secure accommodation, and it's not certain it would be any better. Meanwhile, in the workshop where the inmates worked with wood, Casey was trying to learn new skills. She had never done manual labor before, but the physical work helped distract her from her heavy thoughts. The instructor, an elderly man named Joe, treated her neutrally. All that mattered to him was the quality of her work. Not bad for a beginner, he said, assessing her attempt at making a simple shelf. A little more practice and it'll be just fine. Casey smiled. Praise was rare in prison, and she appreciated every kind word, but her satisfaction was short-lived. Tommy entered the workshop with his men. Joe, give us the plane, he demanded. Thompson is using it, replied the instructor. Wait your turn. Tommy walked over to the workbench where Casey was working. Hey, princess, hand over the tool. I'm not finished yet, Casey said calmly, without looking up. You're finished, Tommy said, putting his hand on the plane. That's a man's tool for a man's job. Casey pursed her lips but stepped back. She knew that an argument could escalate into something more serious. Tommy took the plane and pointedly handed it back to Danny. That's right, he smirked. Know your place. Joe saw what was happening, but didn't intervene. He was a civilian employee, and his influence over the inmates' relationships was limited. Casey finished her work on the shelf and left silently. That evening, in the library, she told Brian what had happened. He listened, clenching his fists. "He had no right," Brian said. "He had the right of force," Casey replied. "That's the only right that works here." "Not always." Brian looked at her intently. "Sometimes people band together to protect each other." "Are you suggesting I seek protection?" Casey's voice sounded bitter. "I fought my whole life for the right to be myself. I'm not going to hide behind someone else's back. It's not hiding, it's survival." They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Casey thought about her life before prison, the difficulties of transition, losing her job, breaking ties with her family. She had been through a lot, but prison was a special challenge. There was no room for individuality, for the right to be different. Brian thought about how quickly his life had changed with Casey's arrival. Before, he had lived quietly, trying not to stick out, counting the days until his release. Now he felt the need to protect, to care, to be needed. It was dangerous, but he couldn't help himself. "Tell me about yourself," Casey asked, "about your life before this place." Brian thought for a moment. A normal life. Work, an apartment, relationships that didn't work out. My mother had cancer and insurance didn't cover the treatment. I tried to get money where I shouldn't have. Family. Just my mother. My father left when I was a teenager. He couldn't accept that he had a gay son. Brian smiled sadly. My mother accepted me. She said that love doesn't depend on who you love. A wise woman. She was. She died 2 months ago. I didn't even get to say goodbye. Casey reached out and touched his shoulder. The touch was light, but Brian felt something change between them. It was a moment of real closeness, rare in a place where human warmth was in short supply. "I'm sorry," she said. "What about your family?" "They disowned me. When I started transitioning, my parents said they didn't have a son anymore. My sister tried to stay in touch, but then she distanced herself too." Casey sighed. "Being myself turned out to be more expensive than I thought." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Free library time was ending, and the inmates were dispersing to their cells. Brian and Casey left together, but at the fork in the hallway, they had to part ways. "See you tomorrow," Casey said. "Sure," Brian replied. Tommy saw them from around the corner. He stood in the shadows, watching the couple who, in his opinion, were disrupting the natural order of things. His anger grew with each passing day. He couldn't understand how the administration allowed such things to happen, how the other inmates tolerated the presence of someone who, in his opinion, shouldn't be in a men's prison. In his cell, Brian lay on his bunk, thinking about his conversation with Casey. Tommy sat at the table reading a letter from his wife. The atmosphere in the cell was tense. Both men understood that a conflict was growing between them that would sooner or later erupt into open conflict. "Don't play with fire, Morgan," Tommy said, without looking up from the letter. "I don't know what you're talking about," Brian replied. "You know what I'm talking about, and I'm warning you, don't drag me into your problems." Brian said nothing, but he knew that the time of peaceful coexistence with his neighbor was coming to an end. Tommy was not the kind of person to forgive what he considered a betrayal of male solidarity. In her solitary cell, Casey wrote a letter to her sister, another attempt to reconnect with her family. She wrote about her life, the books she was reading, her hopes for the future. But she didn't write about her fears, her daily struggle to survive, or how hard it was to remain human in a place where humanity seemed like a luxury. Dr. Wilson, reviewing the day's reports, noted an increase in minor conflicts in the block. Nothing serious, but the trend was alarming. She decided to conduct additional sessions with key figures in the conflict. Officer Davis was making his rounds before the shift change. He saw the inmates gathering in groups and the atmosphere in the corridors changing. Experience told him that something serious was brewing. But for now, all he could do was watch and prepare for the worst. So passed the second week of Casey's stay in prison. The relationships between the main characters in the story became increasingly complex and tense. Brian and Casey found support and understanding in each other, but their closeness provoked growing aggression from Tommy and his group. The prison administration tried to control the situation, but realized that it was impossible to completely prevent conflict. The invisible bonds that formed between people in the confined space of the prison became increasingly strong and dangerous. Every day brought them closer to a denouement that would change the lives of everyone involved in this story. The third week began with an incident in the shower. Casey always tried to shower when there were fewer people around, but this time she couldn't avoid a confrontation. She walked into the shower and found Tommy with two of his henchmen. "Oh, look who's here," Tommy smirked, making no attempt to cover himself. "The princess has decided to take a shower." Casey turned to leave, but Danny blocked her way. "Where are you rushing off to? Maybe you can help us scrub our backs?" He laughed nastily. "Get out of the way," Casey said firmly. "What if I don't?" Danny took a step forward, and Casey smelled his unwashed body. At that moment, Brian entered the shower room. He assessed the situation in a second and stood next to Casey. "Any problems?" he asked, looking straight at Tommy. "No problems, neighbor," Tommy replied, but there was a threat in his voice. "Just getting to know the new girl." "The introduction is over." Brian took Casey by the hand. "Let's go." They left the shower room under the angry glares of the trio. Casey was trembling with humiliation and fear, but she tried not to show it. "Thanks," she said when they were at a safe distance. "You're welcome, but this isn't over." Brian was right. Tommy took his intervention as a declaration of war. That evening in his cell, he made no secret of his anger. "You disgraced me, Morgan," he said, clenching his fists. "You stood up for that thing in front of everyone." "That person," Brian replied calmly. "I stood up for a human being." "A human being?" Tommy jumped up from his bunk. "He's a freak of nature, and you're involved with him. He's my friend. If you don't like it, you can ask for a transfer to another cell." Tommy looked at him suspiciously. In the 8 months they had lived together, he had grown accustomed to his quiet, easygoing roommate. Now there was a different man standing before him, determined and ready for confrontation. "Fine," Tommy said slowly, "but remember, I warned you." The next morning, Dr. Wilson was conducting a session with Casey. She noticed that her patient had become more withdrawn and tense. "How are you doing? How are you adjusting?" Sarah asked. "Fine," Casey replied, but avoided eye contact. "Casey, I'm here to help. If something is going on, you can tell me." Casey was silent for a few minutes, then said, "Dr. Wilson, what happens to people in extreme situations? Why do some become violent, while others remain humane?" "That's a difficult question. A lot depends on upbringing, on inner values, on how a person sees themselves in the world. And if a person struggles their whole life to be themselves, does that make them stronger or weaker?" Sarah understood that behind these philosophical questions lay real pain. The struggle for authenticity requires tremendous inner strength, but it can also make a person vulnerable to those who don't understand or accept differences. "I'm tired of fighting," Casey said quietly. "Sometimes I think it would be easier to live like everyone else. But then it wouldn't be your life." After the session, Sarah wrote in her journal, "The patient is under pressure, possible attempts at self-harm or suicide, close observation required." Meanwhile, a new conflict was brewing in the workshop. Casey was working on an order, simple wooden boxes for a prison warehouse. She was concentrating on planing the boards when Rick Spencer approached her. "Listen, princess," he said quietly, so as not to attract the instructor's attention. "Tommy says either you ask for a transfer yourself, or we'll transfer you." Casey didn't look up from her work. "Tell Tommy I'm not going anywhere." "Don't bother. This isn't the place for someone like you." "The court decides where I belong, not Tommy." Rick smirked. "We'll see what you say in a week." He left, and Casey continued working, but her hands were shaking. She knew the threat was serious. There were many ways to hurt someone in prison, and not all of them left visible marks. That evening in the library, Brian noticed that Casey looked particularly depressed. "What's wrong?" he asked. Casey told him about her conversation with Rick. Brian listened, his face growing darker. "They wouldn't dare," he said. "There are too many witnesses." "You're naive," Casey replied. "In prison, you can stage an accident so that no one can prove anything. Then we need to talk to the administration. And what will we say? That they're threatening me?" I didn't record the conversation. Brian knew she was right. The prison system was flawed, and often the administration could only act after something irreparable had happened. "There's another way," he said thoughtfully. "What is it?" "Find allies. Not everyone here shares Tommy's views." Casey shook her head. "Who would want to get involved in trouble because of me? You'd be surprised. There are a lot of people here who understand what it means to be an outcast." The next day, Brian began to cautiously test the waters. He talked to inmates he knew to be intelligent and fair-minded. The reactions varied. Carlos Mendez, an elderly man serving time for drug trafficking, listened attentively. "I understand your problem, kid," he said, "but it's a dangerous game. Tommy's not the forgiving type. If we don't say anything, he'll think he can do whatever he wants." "Maybe, but there's a difference between justice and suicide." Mike O'Connor, an Irishman with tattoos on his arms, reacted more positively. "Brooks is taking too much on himself," he said. "It's time to show him he's not the king around here. Will you help?" "I'll think about it. But if it comes to a fight, I'm not taking a punch for someone else's principles." James Watson, a former teacher convicted of embezzlement, was more cautious. "I understand that what's happening is unfair," he said, "but I have a family, children. I need to get out of here in one piece." By the end of the week, Brian realized that he couldn't count on any serious support. Most of the inmates preferred not to get involved in other people's conflicts. It was understandable and rational, but it didn't help solve the problem. Officer Davis wasn't sitting idly by either. He had an informal chat with Tommy, trying to get him to see the danger of escalating the conflict. "Brooks, I know you're unhappy with the situation," he said, "but any attempts at vigilante justice will be dealt with severely." "I don't know what you're talking about, officer," Tommy replied innocently. "I'm a law-abiding inmate." "Exactly, and I want you to stay that way." Davis knew his words would have little effect on Tommy, but he wanted to show that the administration was monitoring the situation. That same day, he spoke with prison warden Robert Hayes. "The situation is heating up," Davis reported. "Maybe we should take some preventive measures." "Like what?" asked Hayes, an older guy who'd been in the system for 30 years. "Transfer Thompson to another block, or isolate Brooks." "On what grounds?" "No one's broken any rules yet." "Sir, with all due respect, we can't wait until someone gets hurt." Hayes sighed. "Davis, I understand your concern, but our hands are tied. We can't punish people for their thoughts or words, only for their actions. What if their actions lead to tragedy? Then we'll investigate and punish those responsible. But preventive measures without grounds could set a precedent that will come back to haunt us in the future." Davis understood his boss's logic, but he didn't like it. He could see a storm brewing, but there was nothing he could do to prevent it. Meanwhile, the psychological pressure on Casey intensified. Tommy and his men did not engage in overtly aggressive behavior, but they created an atmosphere of constant threat. They appeared wherever Casey went, looked at her with open hostility, and whispered behind her back. In the dining room, they sat at the table next to hers and loudly discussed the problems of modern society. In the workshop, they interfered with her work, accidentally bumping into her and damaging her work pieces. In the hallways, they formed human walls, forcing her to walk around them or squeeze through. Casey held her ground, but the tension took its toll on her health. She slept poorly, lost her appetite, and became irritable. Dr. Wilson suggested antidepressants, but Casey refused. "I don't want to dull my feelings," she said. "If I stop feeling the danger, I won't be able to defend myself. But stress can lead to a nervous breakdown. Better a breakdown than death." Brian saw Casey changing, and it worried him. He tried to support her, spending more time with her, but he knew his options were limited. "Maybe we should talk to the administration," he suggested again. "And say what? That I don't like the way the other inmates look at me?" Casey smiled wearily. "Davis sees everything. If he could do something, he would have already. Then what? Wait, and hope they limit themselves to psychological pressure." But Brian knew there was little hope. Tommy was the kind of person who saw things through to the end. Sooner or later, he would move from threats to action. At the end of the third week, another incident occurred. Casey was returning from the workshop when Tommy, Danny, and Rick surrounded her in the hallway. "Time's up, princess," Tommy said. "Tomorrow you're filing for a transfer." "No," Casey replied. "No, yes. Otherwise things will get bad." "Things are already bad. They can't get any worse." Tommy grinned. "Oh, how wrong you are." He nodded to his men, and they closed the circle. Casey realized that something serious was about to happen. But at that moment, Brian appeared in the hallway. "What's going on?" he asked, approaching the group. "None of your business, Morgan," Tommy replied. "Go on your way." "I'm not going. Casey, are you okay?" "Yes, now," she said, but her voice was trembling. Tommy realized that the moment had passed. There were too many witnesses, too much attention. He backed away, but his gaze promised that this wasn't over. "Morgan, you've signed your own death warrant," he said quietly, so that only the four of them could hear. "Maybe," Brian replied, "but it's my choice." That evening, Tommy called a council of war. In addition to his usual allies, several other inmates who were unhappy with the breach of order joined them. "Tomorrow we'll settle this once and for all," he said. "Those two have gone too far." "What exactly do you propose?" asked Danny. "We'll show them that in a men's prison there are men's rules, and whoever breaks them gets what they deserve." "What about the guards?" "The guards can't be everywhere. We'll find a moment." "Tommy, what if it comes to murder?" Rick asked cautiously. "Then it will," Tommy replied coldly. "Some things are more important than life." The plan was simple and brutal. They would wait for a moment when Brian and Casey were in a relatively safe place without video surveillance. There weren't many such places in the prison, but there were some. They would strike quickly and harshly to teach everyone else a lesson. Brian couldn't sleep that night. He lay on his bunk, listening to Tommy breathing on the top bunk, knowing that tomorrow could be the last day of his life, or Casey's, or both of theirs. In the next cell, Casey was also awake. She was writing a letter to her sister, perhaps her last. She wrote that she did not regret her choice, that it was better to live a short life in accordance with her principles than a long one in conflict with herself. Officer Davis walked around the blocks and sensed that the atmosphere had changed. The tension was almost palpable. He doubled the number of rounds, but he knew it might not help. Dr. Wilson worked late into the night, trying to find a way to prevent a tragedy. She called her colleagues, studied precedents, and looked for legal grounds for intervention. But time was against her. That was how Casey's third week in prison ended. Everyone involved in the conflict knew that the end was near. Tommy and his group were preparing for decisive action. Brian and Casey were preparing to defend themselves or die. The administration was preparing for the worst, but couldn't prevent the inevitable. Thursday began as usual. Wake up at 6 in the morning, breakfast in the dining hall, roll call for work. Casey, as always, headed to the workshop, where she was working on an order for wooden boxes. Brian went to the library, His shift started at 8. Officer Davis was holding a morning briefing with his junior staff. He emphasized the need for increased surveillance in the block where the main participants in the brewing conflict were being held. "Keep your eyes open," he said. "At the slightest sign of aggression, report immediately." Young Officer Stevens raised his hand. "What should we do if the conflict does break out?" "Break it up, isolate the instigators, call for backup, but it's better not to let it get to that point." In the workshop, Casey was concentrating on her work with a plane. Instructor Joe noticed that she had become more nervous, looking around frequently and flinching at loud noises. He wanted to talk to her but didn't know how to start the conversation. At 10 o'clock, Tommy and his men entered the workshop. They were supposed to be working in the next shop, but Tommy headed straight for Casey. "Last time I'm asking," he said quietly so the instructor couldn't hear. "Are you filing for a transfer?" "No," Casey replied without stopping her work. "Then that's your choice." Tommy left, but his words sounded like a final sentence. Casey felt her hands begin to shake. She knew that the time of peaceful coexistence was over. In the library, Brian was restlessly arranging books. He glanced at his watch several times, calculating when Casey's shift in the workshop would end. She usually came to the library after work, and they spent time together discussing books they had read or just talking. At 11:30, the shift in the workshop ended. The prisoners dispersed to their respective activities, some to their cells, some to the dining hall, and some to the library. Casey gathered her tools and headed for the exit. "Thompson," her instructor Joe called out to her. "Good work today. The boxes turned out nice and even." "Thanks," Casey smiled. It was the last smile of her life. Leaving the workshop, she headed down the hallway toward the library. The hallway was quite long, with several turns. In one of them, where there were no surveillance cameras, an ambush awaited her. Tommy, Danny, and Rick stood in an alcove near the utility room. They had been waiting patiently for half an hour, knowing Casey's schedule. When they heard familiar footsteps, they got ready for action. Casey was walking, thinking about the book she wanted to borrow from the library. Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. She had wanted to reread this story about justice and prejudice for a long time. Ironically, she didn't know that in a few seconds she would become a victim of the same prejudices. When she reached the alcove, Tommy gave the signal. The trio emerged from their hiding place, blocking Casey's retreat. "Take your time, Princess," Tommy said. Casey stopped. Her heart was beating faster, but she tried to remain calm. "What do you want?" "Justice," Danny replied. "You've been bullying normal people for too long. I haven't hurt anyone." "You have, with your very existence." Rick took a step forward. "There's no place for perverts in a men's prison." Casey tried to get around them, but Tommy blocked her way. "This conversation isn't over. I have nothing to say to you." "We have something to say to you." Tommy nodded to his accomplices. Danny pulled a sharpened knife from his belt, a homemade knife made from a piece of metal wrapped in electrical tape. In prison, they called weapons like this pens. Sharp, easy to hide, and deadly. Casey saw the glint of metal and knew it was over. But she didn't beg or try to run. Instead, she stood up straight and looked Tommy straight in the eye. "You'll kill me, but it won't change anything. There are more like me. The world is changing." "Then we'll change it back," Tommy replied. He took the knife from Danny. The metal was cold and heavy in his hand. He had been preparing for this moment for days, but now that the time had come to act, he felt strangely calm. "Last chance," he said. "Ask for forgiveness for what you are." "I will not ask forgiveness for being a human being." Those words were the last straw for Tommy. All his life, he had believed that the world should be simple and straightforward. Men and women, normal and abnormal, friends and enemies. Casey was destroying that simplicity, and he couldn't stand it. The blow was quick and precise. The knife entered Casey's stomach under her ribs, probing for her heart. She gasped and doubled over, pressing her hands against the wound. Blood seeped between her fingers. "That's right," Tommy said with satisfaction. But Casey didn't fall. She straightened up, looking at her killers with surprising calm. "You think this will solve the problem?" she whispered. "But the problem isn't me. The problem is you." Tommy struck again, this time in her chest. Casey fell to her knees but continued to speak. "I don't regret being myself. It's the only thing we have the right to be." The third blow landed on her neck. Casey fell on her side, blood flowing from her mouth. Her eyes began to blur, but she still tried to say something. Tommy leaned over her. "What, princess? Last words?" "Forgive them," Casey whispered. "They don't know what they're doing." Those were her last words. Her eyes closed and her breathing stopped. Casey Thompson died in a prison hallway, killed for daring to be herself. Tommy stood over her body, breathing heavily. His hands and clothes were covered in blood. Danny and Rick looked at him in horror. They had expected a fight, maybe a beating, but not murder. "You killed her," Danny whispered. "We killed her," Tommy corrected. "All of us. Now shut up and listen." He quickly explained the plan. They had to get rid of the weapon, wash away the blood, and establish an alibi. They had a few minutes before the body would be discovered. "What if we get caught?" asked Rick. "We won't get caught if you keep your mouth shut," replied Tommy. "Say you didn't see anything. You don't know anything. Someone else killed her." They quickly left the scene of the crime, heading in different directions. Tommy went to the shower to wash off the blood. Danny and Rick split up and went to their cells, trying to look normal. Casey's body was discovered by an inmate named Marcus Jones, who was on his way to the library. When he saw the pool of blood and the motionless figure, he screamed so loudly that he was heard in the neighboring blocks. Officer Stevens was the first to respond to the screams. Seeing the dead body, he immediately pressed the alarm button and called for backup. "Code Red, Block B, Corridor 7, he said into his radio. "Inmate wounded. No, dead. Medical assistance and an investigation team are required." In the library, Brian heard the sirens and felt his heart sink with fear. He knew Casey should have been there half an hour ago. His intuition told him something terrible had happened. He tried to leave the library, but a guard stopped him. "No one is allowed out. There's a quarantine." "What happened?" "We don't know yet. Stay quiet and wait." But Brian couldn't sit still. He paced around the library like a caged animal, sensing that disaster was approaching. Dr. Wilson was in her office when she heard the sirens. She immediately realized that what everyone had been dreading had happened. Quickly gathering her documents, she headed for the scene. Officer Davis arrived a few minutes after the alarm was raised. Seeing Casey's body in a pool of blood, he closed his eyes and cursed under his breath. He knew this could happen. He had warned his superiors, but he couldn't prevent the tragedy. "Who found the body?" he asked Stevens. "Jones. He's over there, in shock." Davis approached Marcus, who was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall. "Marcus, what did you see?" "Nothing. I was just going to the library and saw it," Marcus said, pointing with a trembling hand at the body. "Who could have done this?" "We'll find out. Did you see anyone? Anything suspicious?" "No, the hallway was empty." Half an hour later, the investigation team arrived, led by Detective Robert Henderson. An experienced police officer, he had investigated many murders, but crimes in prisons were always particularly difficult. "What do we have?" he asked Davis. "Casey Thompson, 32 years old, killed about an hour ago. Multiple stab wounds. No weapon found. Enemies?" There were conflicts with a group of inmates. Tommy Brooks and his crew were openly hostile toward the victim. "Why?" Davis explained the situation with the transgender woman being placed in the men's block and the ensuing conflicts. "I see," Henderson nodded. "Classic motive. Hate for someone different. Where's Brooks now?" In the shower. We've already isolated all potential suspects. Henderson examined the crime scene. There was a lot of blood, indicating the brutality of the attack. The absence of signs of a struggle suggested that the victim had been taken by surprise or had not resisted. Surveillance cameras? None here. This is one of the few places in the block without video surveillance. Convenient for a killer, so the crime was planned. Tommy was the first to be questioned. He sat in the isolation cell, outwardly calm but tense inside. When the detective and Officer Davis entered, he looked up. "Tommy Brooks?" Henderson asked. "Yes." "Where were you today between 11:30 and 12? "In the shower. I was washing up after work." "Who can confirm that?" "The other inmates. Ask them." "We'll be sure to ask them. How was your relationship with Casey Thompson?" "No relationship. I hardly knew her." "But you expressed dissatisfaction with her presence in the men's block?" Tommy shrugged. "Everyone has an opinion. That's not a crime." "Murder is a crime. And I think you know more about this murder than you're telling us. Think what you want. You don't have any facts." Henderson knew that Tommy wouldn't confess without solid evidence. An experienced criminal, he knew how to behave during an interrogation. Danny and Ricka were questioned separately. Both were nervous but stuck to their story. They hadn't seen anything. They didn't know anything. They hadn't been in contact with Thompson. But the detective could see that they were hiding the truth. There were too many coincidences, too many flimsy alibis. When Brian was questioned, he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. "I knew this would happen," he said through tears. "I warned everyone that Tommy was dangerous, but no one listened." "Tell us about your relationship with the victim." "We were friends. Casey was a special person, smart, kind, strong. She didn't deserve to die like that." "Do you know who could have killed her?" "Tommy Brooks. He threatened her, humiliated her, made her life unbearable. This was a hate crime." "Did you and Miss Thompson have a romantic relationship?" Brian fell silent. "We understood each other. That's rare in this place." By evening, news of the murder had spread throughout the prison. The reaction varied. Some inmates sympathized with the victim. Others believed she was to blame for what happened. The administration announced heightened security. All inmates were locked in their cells, and all activities and work were canceled. The prison was plunged into silence, broken only by the sound of guards' footsteps. Dr. Wilson worked with those who were traumatized by the incident. Brian needed urgent psychological help. He blamed himself for not being able to protect Casey. "It's not your fault," she told him. "You couldn't have prevented what was planned by others." "I should have been there. I should have been. Then they would have killed you too." Prison Warden Hayes called an emergency meeting. A murder in the facility was an extraordinary event that could lead to dismissals and criminal charges against the administration. "How could this have happened?" he asked his subordinates. "We warned about the growing conflict," Davis replied, "but we had no grounds for preventive measures. Now we do. And the consequences will be severe for all of us." The media had already received information about the murder. Journalists gathered at the prison gates, demanding comments. The story of the murder of a transgender woman in a men's prison attracted public attention and raised questions about the policy of housing LGBT+ prisoners. The prison was restless that night. In the cells, inmates whispered, discussing what had happened. Tommy lay on his bunk in solitary confinement, realizing that his life had changed forever. He had killed a man and now had to take responsibility. Brian couldn't close his eyes. He remembered his last conversation with Casey, her words about how it was better to live a short life in accordance with one's principles. Now those words had taken on a prophetic meaning. In the morgue, Casey's body awaited an autopsy. Death had ended her fight to be herself, but that fight would continue in the hearts of those who remembered her. The investigation continued for 3 days. Detective Henderson methodically gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and studied surveillance footage from nearby corridors. Gradually, the picture of the crime became clearer. The breakthrough came on the fourth day when a search of Tommy's cell revealed bloody clothing hidden in a ventilation shaft. DNA testing confirmed that it was Casey Thompson's blood. "Well, Brooks, still don't know anything about the murder?" Henderson asked, showing him photos of the evidence. Tommy looked at the pictures silently. He knew the game was over, but he wasn't going to give up without a fight. "It's a setup," he said finally. "Someone planted those clothes." "Who exactly? And why?" "I don't know. Maybe the person who actually killed Thompson." But Henderson didn't believe him. Too much evidence pointed to Tommy and his accomplices. Camera footage showed them in the area of the prison at the time of the murder. Witnesses confirmed their hostile attitude toward the victim. Rick Spencer's confession was the deciding factor. The weakest of the three, he couldn't handle the psychological pressure and told the truth in exchange for a reduced sentence. "It was all Tommy's idea," he cried during questioning. "He said we'd just scare her. I didn't know he was going to kill her." "But you participated in the attack?" "We just stood there. Tommy did everything himself. We didn't even touch her." "But you didn't stop the murder?" Rick fell silent. It was the truth, and he couldn't deny it. Danny held out longer, but when he found out about Rick's confession, he also decided to cooperate with the investigation. His testimony completely matched Spencer's version. Tommy was left alone. Even his court-appointed lawyer advised him to plead guilty in exchange for life imprisonment instead of the death penalty. "Think about your family," the lawyer said. "You have a wife and children. They need a living father, even if he's in prison." But Tommy was stubborn. "I will not apologize for defending normality." A month later, the trial began. The case received widespread media coverage as a symbol of discrimination and hatred toward LGBT+ people. Activists gathered outside the courthouse with signs reading, "Justice for Casey" and "Stop Hate Crimes." Brian was the main witness for the prosecution. In the month following the murder, he lost a lot of weight, his hair turned gray, and a permanent sadness settled in his eyes. "Tell the court about your relationship with the deceased," asked prosecutor David Miller. "Casey was my friend," Brian said quietly. "The only real friend I had in prison. She was a smart, kind, strong woman. She didn't deserve to die like that." "Were you aware of the defendant's hostility toward Ms. Thompson?" Tommy openly threatened her. He said that transgender people shouldn't be in a men's prison. He made her life unbearable. "Did you warn the administration?" "We spoke to Dr. Wilson and Officer Davis, but they said they couldn't take action without specific violations." Tommy's lawyer tried to discredit Brian's testimony by hinting at his special relationship with the victim. "Isn't it true, Mr. Morgan, that you were in love with Miss Thompson?" "I respected and valued her as a person." "That doesn't answer my question." Brian paused. "Yes, I had feelings for her, but that doesn't make my testimony false." Dr. Wilson testified about the psychological state of all those involved in the conflict. "Casey Thompson was under constant stress," she said. "I warned the administration about the possible consequences, but we lacked the resources to effectively protect vulnerable inmates." "And what can you say about the defendant?" Tommy Brooks showed signs of deep-rooted prejudice and a tendency toward aggression when confronted with what he considered unacceptable. Officer Davis recounted his attempts to prevent the conflict. "I knew the situation was volatile," he said, "but our options are limited by the law. We can't isolate people for their thoughts or words." "Do you regret not taking more decisive action?" Davis was silent for a long time. "Every day, but even now, I don't know what I could have done differently within the existing system." The most dramatic moment came when Rick and Danny took the stand. Both admitted their guilt, but tried to shift the blame onto Tommy. "He said we'd just scare her," Rick repeated. "I never thought it would come to murder." "But you didn't stop him?" "I was afraid. Tommy was our leader. We were used to listening to him." The defense attorney tried to build a case around the idea that his clients were victims of prison culture and peer pressure. "My client is not a monster," he said. "He is a product of a system that encourages violence and discrimination. He needs treatment, not execution." But the prosecutor was unrelenting. This was a cold-blooded murder, planned and carried out with hatred. The defendant has shown no remorse. Tommy refused to testify, but stood up during closing arguments and addressed the court. "I don't regret what I did. Casey Thompson was a symbol of what is destroying our society. If we don't defend traditional values, we will lose everything." His words caused an uproar in the courtroom. The judge called for order. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of first-degree murder. Rick and Danny were found guilty of accessory to murder. In her sentencing, Judge Elizabeth Harris said, "This murder has shaken not only the prison community, but society as a whole. Casey Thompson was killed for daring to be herself. This is unacceptable in a civilized society." Tommy was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rick is 25 and Danny is 30. After the trial, Brian gave an interview to reporters. "Casey is dead. The killers have been punished, but that doesn't bring her back to life. The most important thing now is to make sure that tragedies like this never happen again." Casey's murder was a catalyst for change in the prison system. A commission was created to protect the rights of LGBT+ prisoners. New protocols were developed for the placement of transgender people in correctional facilities. Dr. Wilson headed a new psychological support program for vulnerable prisoners. Officer Davis was appointed security coordinator for high-risk units. Mount Vernon Prison became a pilot facility for the implementation of new standards. Additional surveillance cameras were installed, monitoring of inmate behavior was increased, and support groups for minorities were created. But the most important changes took place in people's hearts. Casey's story caused many to rethink their views on tolerance and human dignity. Brian was released early for cooperating with the investigation and exemplary behavior. Upon his release, he became an activist fighting for the rights of LGBT+ people in prisons. Casey said that it is better to live a short life in accordance with your principles than a long life in conflict with yourself. He said at conferences, "Her death was not in vain, if we learn from it." Casey's family, who disowned her while she was alive, tried to reconnect after her death. Her sister Jessica set up the Casey Thompson Memorial Fund, which helps transgender people in prison. "I regret not supporting my sister when she was alive," Jessica said. "But now I can honor her memory by helping people like her." Tommy is serving a life sentence in a maximum security prison. He rarely talks to other inmates and spends his time reading religious literature. He sometimes writes letters to his wife, but she does not respond. She divorced him immediately after the trial. In one of his rare interviews, he said, "I haven't changed my views, but I understand that the way I defended them was wrong." Rick Spencer became a Christian in prison and participates in rehabilitation programs. Danny Krause is studying law and plans to work with former prisoners after his release. The story of the murder at Mount Vernon Prison has become a subject of study in criminology and penology. Many articles and books have been written about how prejudice and hatred can lead to tragedy. But the main lesson of this story is that every person has a right to dignity and safety, regardless of who they are and the choices they make in life. Casey Thompson fought for that right until her last breath, and her fight lives on in the actions of those who remember her story. The truth about what happened in that prison hallway has been established. Justice prevailed in the courtroom. But true victory will only be achieved when tragedies like this become impossible. In the small town of Mount Vernon, where conservative views have long prevailed, a slow but irreversible change in consciousness has begun. Casey's death made people think about the price of prejudice and the importance of accepting differences. Her grave in the local cemetery became a place of pilgrimage for activists from across the country. The words, "Casey Thompson. She dared to be herself," are carved on her headstone.